April 12, 1945. The Rhine Valley. Morning fog clings to the rubble of Wiesbaden like a shroud, thick and gray, swallowing the skeletal remains of apartment blocks and the twisted iron of what was once a tram line. The air smells of damp stone and ash, of things burned and things rotting. In the basement of a half-collapsed tenement on Wilhelmstrasse, 17 women and children huddle in darkness. They have not seen daylight in 3 days. The youngest, a girl of perhaps 4, whimpers softly. Her mother, Frau Margarethe Schultz, holds her close, feeling the child's forehead. It is hot. Dangerously hot. Margarethe's hands tremble. There is no medicine. There has been no medicine for months. The chemist's shop 2 streets over is a crater. The doctor who used to visit their neighborhood died in the bombing raids last October. She does not know what to do. She has never felt so helpless. Outside, the sound of boots. Heavy boots. American boots. The women freeze. They have heard the stories. Whispered in breadlines, murmured in the air raid shelters, printed in the final desperate editions of Der Stürmer before the presses went silent. The Americans are coming. The Bolsheviks of the West. Destroyers. Ravagers. Men without culture, without discipline, without mercy. Frau Schultz clutches her daughter tighter. The boots grow louder. A voice calls out in broken German, asking if anyone is inside. No one answers. Then the door, or what remains of it, is pushed open. Light floods the basement. Silhouettes appear. Tall men in olive uniforms. Helmets. Rifles slung over shoulders. One of them kneels. He is young, perhaps 22, with a soft face that does not match the uniform. He sees the child. He sees the fever in her eyes. He does not raise his weapon. Instead, he reaches into his pack and pulls out a canteen. He offers it to Margarethe. Water. Clean water. She stares at him. She does not understand. He gestures again. Drink. She takes it, hands shaking, and wets her daughter's lips. The soldier smiles. Then he turns and calls to someone outside. Within minutes, another man appears. This one wears a white band on his arm with a red cross. A medic. He kneels beside the child, feels her forehead, checks her pulse. He opens his kit. Inside, Margarethe sees more than she has seen in a year. Bandages. Sulfa powder. Morphine. Penicillin. He works quickly, efficiently, speaking in a calm voice though she does not understand the words. He gives the child an injection. He wraps her in a blanket from his own pack. He tells Margarethe, through the young soldier who translates, that the child will be all right. That they will take her to a field hospital if needed. That there is no charge. No payment required. Free. Margarethe Schultz begins to cry. Not from fear. Not from relief. But from confusion. A deep, unmoored confusion that will haunt her for the rest of her life. Why would they do this? This question, simple and shattering, echoed across Germany in the spring and summer of 1945. It echoed in the ruins of Berlin, in the shattered factories of the Ruhr, in the quiet villages of Bavaria where white sheets hung from windows in surrender. It was asked by mothers and grandmothers, by young girls who had served in the Bund Deutscher Mädel, by women who had believed, with the fervor of the faithful, that the Reich was the pinnacle of civilization and that the Americans were barbarians. The answer to that question, when it came, did not arrive in words. It arrived in acts. Small, persistent, undeniable acts that accumulated like snowfall, silent and overwhelming, until the landscape of belief itself was buried beneath it. To understand the shock, the profound cognitive rupture experienced by German women in the months following surrender, one must first understand what they had been taught to expect. The Nazi regime, in its 12-year reign, had constructed an elaborate edifice of propaganda designed not merely to inform but to shape reality itself. The Goebbels machine, with its rallies and films and endless radio broadcasts, had painted a portrait of the world in stark, Manichaean terms. Germany was the bearer of culture, of order, of scientific and spiritual advancement. The German Volk were inheritors of a noble lineage stretching back to the Teutonic Knights, to the Holy Roman Empire, to the misty forests where Hermann had defeated the Roman legions. They were destined to lead, to civilize, to dominate, and arrayed against them were the forces of chaos, the Slavic hordes to the east, the decadent plutocrats of Britain, and most insidious of all, the Americans. The Americans, in Nazi ideology, were not merely enemies. They were a cautionary tale. A civilization in decline, mongrelized, corrupted by democracy and capitalism and the influence of Jews. They were a nation without culture, without roots, without soul. A land of gangsters and speculators, of assembly lines and jazz music, of shallow materialism masquerading as freedom. German women, in particular, were warned about American soldiers. They were told these men were criminals, drawn from prisons and slums, unleashed upon Europe with license to plunder and rape. They were told that the Americans would treat German women as the Soviets did, with brutality and contempt. Better to die, the propaganda said, than to fall into American hands. In the final weeks of the war, as the Reich collapsed, thousands of German women committed suicide rather than face the occupation. They took poison. They drowned themselves and their children. They did this because they believed. They believed the stories. They believed the Americans were monsters. And then the monsters arrived with medical kits. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and profound. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, American forces established military government in the occupied zones. Part of this governance included the provision of medical care, not only to American soldiers but to the German civilian population. This was not an act of sentiment. It was strategic. Disease, starvation, and social collapse in occupied Germany would threaten the stability of Europe, would hinder reconstruction, would potentially incubate the next totalitarian movement. The Americans understood this. General Eisenhower, despite his personal revulsion at Nazi atrocities, recognized that humanitarian relief was a military necessity. But strategy, however sound, does not explain the experience on the ground. It does not explain the faces of the medics, the gentleness of their hands, the fact that they treated German civilians with the same care they afforded their own wounded. It does not explain why a soldier would give his own rations to a starving child, why a nurse would sit beside a dying German woman and hold her hand, why a field hospital would operate around the clock to save lives without asking for papers, for loyalty oaths, for anything at all. Frau Anneliese Hoffmann, a schoolteacher from Heidelberg, recorded her experience in a diary that would later be archived by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. In an entry dated May 3, 1945, she wrote, "Today I was taken to the American hospital. I have been ill for weeks, coughing blood, unable to stand. I thought I would die in my apartment, alone. But the soldiers came. They carried me on a stretcher. I thought they were taking me to a camp, to a prison. Instead, they brought me to a clean room with white sheets. A doctor examined me. He spoke kindly, though I could not understand him. They gave me medicine. Real medicine, not the ersatz powders we have been using. They fed me soup, warm and thick with vegetables. I asked the nurse, through a translator, what I must pay. She looked confused. She said there was no payment. I asked when I would be released. She said when I was well. I do not understand. We were told the Americans were devils. But devils do not do this. I am frightened, not of them, but of what this means. If they are not what we were told, then what else was a lie? What else was a lie? This question became the crucible in which post-war German identity was forged. It was not asked easily. To ask it was to admit complicity, to acknowledge that the suffering endured and inflicted had been in service of falsehood. It was to confront the possibility that the Reich, the Führer, the entire ideological apparatus that had given meaning and purpose to their lives, had been built on sand. And yet the question could not be avoided. The evidence was too overwhelming. The Americans did not behave as predicted. They did not rape and pillage. They did not starve the population. They brought food. They repaired infrastructure. They established courts, not to exact vengeance, but to administer justice. And most bewildering of all, they provided medical care, freely and without condition, to people who had recently been their mortal enemies. The scale of this medical effort was staggering. By June 1945, the United States Army had established over 200 civilian hospitals in the American occupation zone. These facilities treated more than 500,000 German civilians in the first 6 months of occupation. Typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, malnutrition, trauma from bombing raids, all were addressed with a level of care that had not existed in Germany itself for years. The Reich, in its final desperate months, had diverted all medical resources to the military, to the SS, to the party elite. Civilian hospitals had been stripped of supplies, doctors conscripted, nurses sent to the front. The German people, the very folk the regime claimed to cherish, had been abandoned. And now their conquerors were healing them. The symbolic weight of this cannot be overstated. In Nazi ideology, the body was a metaphor for the nation. Purity, strength, health, these were the measures of racial and national vitality. The regime had built a vast apparatus of public health, not out of compassion, but out of eugenic obsession. The strong were cultivated. The weak were eliminated. Hundreds of thousands of disabled Germans had been murdered in the T4 euthanasia program. Jewish doctors had been expelled, their practices shuttered, their contributions erased. Medicine, under the Nazis, had been weaponized, turned into an instrument of ideology. And here were the Americans, the supposed barbarians, practicing medicine as an act of simple humanity. No ideology. No racial tests. No demands for loyalty. Just care. Just healing. The contrast was unbearable. Frau Greta Lindemann, a widow from Darmstadt, described her encounter with an American field hospital in a letter to her sister in the British zone, dated July 1945. She had been injured in an air raid, her leg shattered by falling debris. For months she had hobbled on a makeshift crutch, the bone healing poorly, infection setting in. When the Americans arrived, a medical officer noticed her limping. He insisted she be examined. She was taken to a surgical unit where an orthopedic surgeon, a captain from Boston, operated on her leg. The surgery took 4 hours. He inserted a metal plate, cleaned the infection, reset the bone. When she woke, he was sitting beside her bed. He smiled and said, in careful German, that she would walk again. She asked why he would do this for her, an enemy. He looked puzzled. He said she was not an enemy. She was a patient. Greta wrote to her sister, "I do not know what to think any more. We were told these people had no honor, no decency. But this man saved my leg. He saved my life. He did not have to. We lost the war. We are the defeated. And yet he treated me as if I mattered, as if my life had value. I feel ashamed, though I do not know of what. Only that the world is not what I believed it to be." The shame Greta described was not personal guilt, not yet. It was something more primal, the shame of discovering that one's foundational understanding of reality has been wrong. Psychologists would later term this cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort of holding two contradictory beliefs simultaneously. The German women liberated and healed by American forces experienced this dissonance with an intensity that left lasting scars. They had been taught that strength justified cruelty, that victory excused atrocity, that the weak existed to serve the strong. And yet here were the victors, the strong, behaving with a gentleness that defied comprehension. The Americans did not gloat. They did not humiliate. When they had every right, every justification, to exact revenge, they instead offered bandages and penicillin. The penicillin itself became a symbol. A small vial of liquid, pale amber, unremarkable to the eye. But to the Germans who received it, it was a kind of miracle. Penicillin, the first true antibiotic, had been developed in Britain and mass-produced in the United States during the war. It saved countless soldiers from infections that would have been fatal. By 1945, American medics carried it as standard issue. German civilians had heard rumors of this wonder drug, but few had seen it. The Reich had no equivalent. German pharmaceutical companies had focused on other compounds, on sulfa drugs and methamphetamines for soldiers, but nothing with the efficacy of penicillin. And now, in the wake of defeat, it was being administered to them. Freely. Women with childbed fever, infections that would have killed them, were cured in days. Children with scarlet fever, diphtheria, infections of wounds, all responded to the drug. The survival rate in American-run hospitals was dramatically higher than in the final months of the Reich. The implications were obvious. The Americans had not only superior firepower and industry. They had superior care. They valued life, even the lives of their enemies, in a way the Reich never had. But the question persisted. Why? Why would they do this? The women who asked it were searching for a motive they could understand, a framework that made sense within their worldview. Some speculated it was a form of psychological warfare, a tactic to win hearts and minds. Others believed it was Christian charity, the Americans being influenced by religious sentiment in a way the secular Reich was not. Still others thought it was simply naivety, that the Americans did not yet understand the true nature of Germans, that this kindness would evaporate once they did. But none of these explanations satisfied. They were too shallow, too transactional. The truth, when it began to emerge, was more radical. The Americans were doing this because they believed in something the Germans had been taught was weakness. They believed in the inherent worth of the individual. They believed that rights, including the right to health and care, were not privileges to be earned but conditions to be protected. They believed, in short, in democracy, not merely as a political system, but as a moral framework. And this belief, as abstract as it seemed, had tangible consequences. It meant that a German woman, defeated and despised, was still a human being deserving of care. It meant that power did not grant license to cruelty. It meant that the strong had obligations to the weak. This revelation was not immediate. It unfolded slowly, over months and years, as the occupation continued and the contrast between American governance and Nazi governance became undeniable. The Americans established civilian courts where Germans could seek redress for grievances. They instituted rationing systems that, while austere, were administered with relative fairness. They allowed Germans to rebuild their lives, their communities, their nation, under supervision but without subjugation. And always, threaded through it all, was the medical care. The hospitals remained open. The clinics continued to operate. The medics kept treating patients. The message, unspoken but clear, was that life mattered. Even here. Even now. Even after everything. Frau Elisabeth Kohler, a nurse who had worked in a Wehrmacht hospital during the war, found herself employed by the American Occupation Authority in late 1945. She was assigned to a clinic in Frankfurt, working alongside American doctors and nurses. In an oral history recorded in 1978, she described the culture shock. "The Americans were so wasteful," she said. "They used fresh bandages for every patient. They threw away supplies we would have cleaned and reused. They had so much. But it was not just the abundance. It was the attitude. In our hospitals under the Reich, we had been trained to see patients as soldiers, as resources for the war effort. If a man could not return to the front, his value diminished. We did not say this aloud, but we knew. The Americans did not think this way. They treated every patient as if that person's life was the only thing that mattered. A German woman with tuberculosis received the same care as an American soldier with the same disease. I did not understand it at first. I thought it was inefficiency. But then I realized it was something else. It was principle. They truly believed all lives had equal worth. This was foreign to me. We had been taught hierarchy, that some lives were more valuable than others. The Americans rejected this. It was their strength, I think. And it was what defeated us, in the end. Not just their tanks and planes, but this idea. This stubborn, irrational idea that every person matters. The idea was indeed stubborn. It was also subversive. As German women encountered it, again and again, in hospitals and clinics, in interactions with medics and doctors, in the simple fact of being treated with dignity, something shifted. Not immediately, not universally, but slowly, painfully, the architecture of belief began to crack. The Nazi ideology had promised them greatness, had told them they were part of a glorious project, that their sacrifices meant something. And then it had collapsed, leaving them in ruins. The Americans, by contrast, promised them nothing except the basics of human decency. And they delivered. This was not glorious. It was not uplifting in the way a Nuremberg rally had been uplifting. But it was real. It was tangible. It was a hand extended in the darkness, offering not salvation but survival. And for many women, this was the beginning of a long, difficult reckoning with the past. The reckoning was not comfortable. To accept American kindness was to admit, implicitly, that the Reich had been wrong. Wrong in its ideology, wrong in its methods, wrong in its very foundation. This was a conclusion many Germans resisted. In the years immediately following the war, denial and rationalization were common. The atrocities were blamed on the SS, on Hitler, on a few fanatics, while the broader population claimed ignorance. The medical care provided by the Americans was acknowledged, even appreciated, but often framed as an anomaly, as the actions of a few good individuals rather than a reflection of American values. This psychological maneuvering was understandable. To fully confront the truth, that they had supported a regime of monstrous evil, and that their supposed enemies were more humane than they had ever been, was almost unbearable. But the truth had a way of persisting. It lived in the stories women told each other, in the diaries they kept, in the gradual rebuilding of their lives under occupation. It lived in the contrast between what they had been promised and what they had received. The Reich had promised them glory and delivered catastrophe. The Americans had promised them nothing and delivered care. One recurring image in the accounts of German women from this period is the American Jeep. The Jeep, ubiquitous in the occupation, was a rolling symbol of American abundance. Sturdy, reliable, capable of navigating the rubble-strewn streets, it appeared everywhere, carrying supplies, transporting patients, delivering aid. To the Germans, who had watched their own vehicles requisitioned, who had seen horses and bicycles become the primary means of transport as fuel disappeared, the Jeep was a marvel and a reproach. It represented a level of industrial capacity they could not match, a logistical efficiency they had never possessed. But more than that, it represented the American approach to the occupation. The jeeps did not arrive with fanfare. They simply appeared, day after day, doing their work, taking women to hospitals, bringing doctors to remote villages, ferrying medicine from supply depots to clinics. They were mundane and miraculous at once. And they were tireless. The Americans, it seemed, did not run out of anything. Not fuel, not medicine, not patience. This was incomprehensible to people who had spent the last years of the war in a state of perpetual scarcity, who had been told that shortages were sacrifices for the greater good, who had believed the propaganda that Germany's enemies were on the brink of collapse. The jeeps, arriving each morning without fail, carrying their cargo of care, were proof that the propaganda had been lies. The Americans were not collapsing. They were thriving. And they were using their abundance, not to crush the defeated, but to rebuild them. In the autumn of 1945, an American medical officer, Captain Robert Sullivan of the 4th Armored Division, wrote a letter to his wife in Pennsylvania. The letter, now part of the National Archives, describes his work in a makeshift clinic in Mannheim. "We see dozens of women and children every day," he wrote. "Most are malnourished. Many have infections, TB, typhus. Some are injured from the bombings. They come in afraid, expecting the worst. You can see it in their eyes. They've been told we're monsters. And then we treat them. We give them food, medicine, care. And they don't know how to react. Some cry. Some are silent. A few thank us, though you can tell they don't understand why we're doing it. I don't think they've ever experienced this kind of care without strings attached. Everything under the Nazis was conditional, tied to loyalty or racial purity or some other damn thing. The idea that we just help them because they're human beings, because they need help, is alien to them. It makes me angry, Jen. Not at them, but at what was done to them. They were lied to, used, and then abandoned by their own government. And now they're shocked that we're not doing the same. It's heartbreaking. But it's also the work that matters. If we can show them that there's another way, that power doesn't have to mean cruelty, maybe something good can come out of this mess. I don't know. I just know I can't look at a sick child and not help. That's not about politics. That's about being human." Captain Sullivan's words capture the ethos that guided many American personnel during the occupation. It was not a perfect ethos. The occupation had its share of problems, of abuses, of racial tensions and black marketeering. American soldiers were not saints. But the institutional framework, the policies set by Eisenhower and the military government, embodied a principle that was, in the context of post-war Europe, revolutionary. That principle was accountability. The Americans held themselves to standards. They court-martialed soldiers who committed crimes against civilians. They investigated complaints. They maintained discipline. This was not because they were morally superior as individuals, but because their system, however flawed, was built on the assumption that power must be constrained. The checks and balances of democracy, the rule of law, the belief in human rights, these were not abstractions. They were operational guidelines. And German women, living under this system, could see the difference. They could see that justice, however imperfect, was possible. That care could be given without coercion. That a society could function without terror. This did not mean the occupation was welcomed. It was not. The presence of foreign troops, the restrictions on movement, the denazification programs, the trials at Nuremberg, all of these were sources of resentment and resistance. But beneath the resentment, there was also a growing recognition. A recognition that the Americans, for all their faults, were offering something the Reich never had. A future. Not a glorious future, Not a future of domination and conquest, but a future of normalcy, of rebuilding, of living without fear. And central to that future was the experience of being cared for. The women who had been treated in American hospitals carried that experience with them. They told their daughters, their neighbors, their friends. They passed it down. And in the passing, it became part of the foundation on which a new Germany would be built. By the winter of 1946, the immediate crisis had eased. The threat of mass starvation had been averted through food aid from the United States. The epidemics of typhus and dysentery had been brought under control. The hospitals, many of them now staffed by German personnel under American supervision, were functioning with something approaching normalcy. The shock of the occupation had given way to a wary coexistence. But the question remained. Why would they do this? It was asked less frequently now, but it lingered, unanswered, a splinter in the collective consciousness. Some women found answers in religion, interpreting American kindness as Christian charity. Others found answers in pragmatism, believing the Americans were simply securing their own interests. But a few, a growing few, found answers in something more fundamental. They began to understand that the Americans were not acting out of strategy or sentiment alone. They were acting out of conviction. A conviction that human dignity was not contingent, not conditional, not something to be granted by the state. It was inherent. And from that conviction flowed everything else. The medical care, the fairness, the restraint. The Americans were not perfect. They made mistakes. They were often ignorant of German culture, insensitive to German suffering, blind to their own privilege. But they were trying. They were trying to uphold an ideal, even when it was difficult, even when it would have been easier to give in to anger and vengeance. And that effort, that stubborn insistence on principle, was what ultimately answered the question. They did this because they believed it was right. Not expedient. Not strategic. Right. This belief, so simple and so profound, was the weapon the Nazis could never have anticipated. They had prepared for military defeat. They had prepared for occupation. They had even prepared, in their darkest fantasies, for annihilation. But they had not prepared for mercy. They had not prepared for an enemy who would heal rather than harm, who would rebuild rather than destroy. The Americans, with their medical kits and their jeeps and their quiet competence, dismantled the ideology of the Reich more effectively than any propaganda could have. They did it not by arguing, not by lecturing, not by forcing Germans to confront their guilt, though that would come later. They did it by simply behaving as decent human beings, by treating the sick, by feeding the hungry, by extending a hand to those who had, so recently, been their mortal enemies. This was the great irony of the occupation. The Reich had tried to make Germans hard, to make them ruthless, to teach them that compassion was weakness. And then, in defeat, they encountered an enemy whose strength was rooted in compassion, whose power was tempered by principle, whose victory was expressed not in cruelty but in care. In the decades that followed, Germany rebuilt. The Marshall Plan brought economic aid. The Federal Republic was established, with its commitment to democracy and human rights. The German people, particularly the younger generation, engaged in a painful but necessary process of confronting the Nazi past. Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the struggle to come to terms with history, became a defining feature of German identity. And in that struggle, the memory of the occupation played a complex role. For some, it was a source of lingering resentment, a reminder of defeat and humiliation. For others, it was a source of gratitude, a recognition that the Americans, at a critical moment, had chosen generosity over vengeance. But for the women who had experienced it firsthand, who had lain in American field hospitals, who had received penicillin and care and kindness when they had expected only punishment, it was something more. It was the moment when the old world ended and the new world began. It was the moment when they realized that everything they had been taught was wrong, that the enemy was not the monster, that the monster had been within, and that the path forward, the only path forward, was to embrace the values they had once despised: democracy, equality, compassion, the stubborn, irrational belief that every person matters. Frau Margarethe Schultz, the woman who had huddled in a basement with her fevered daughter on that April morning in 1945, lived until 1992. In her final years, she gave an interview to a German filmmaker documenting stories of the occupation. She spoke of that day, of the American medic who had saved her child's life. She spoke of the confusion she had felt, the shame, the slow realization that her entire worldview had been built on lies. And then she said something that the filmmaker would later describe as the most powerful moment of the entire project. She said, "They did not have to do it. That is what I could never understand. They did not have to care for us. They did not have to save my daughter. We were the enemy. We had supported the regime that killed their soldiers, that bombed their cities, that tried to destroy their way of life. And yet they saved her. They saved us. And in doing so, they saved more than our lives. They saved the possibility of redemption. They showed us that we could be more than what we had been, that we could choose a different path. I do not know if I have walked that path well. I do not know if any of us have. But the Americans, with their kindness, their mercy, gave us the chance to try. That is why I believe in democracy. Not because it is perfect, but because it allows for mercy. It allows for second chances. It allows for the possibility that even the defeated, even the guilty, can be redeemed. The Nazis never believed in that. They believed only in strength and domination. And that is why they lost. Not because they were weaker, but because they were wrong. The white sheets, the sterile smell of antiseptic, the weight of a blanket, clean and warm, placed over trembling shoulders, the taste of real soup, thick with vegetables, the first warm meal in weeks, the sound of a medic's voice, calm and steady, speaking words in a foreign tongue that nevertheless conveyed care, the feel of a needle, sharp but brief, delivering medicine that would cure rather than kill. These sensory memories, scattered across thousands of German women, became the foundation of a new understanding. They were small things, mundane things, but they were also revolutionary things. They were the proof, undeniable and visceral, that another world was possible, a world where power was exercised with restraint, where victory did not demand humiliation, where the strong protected the weak, where life, all life, had value. In the end, the question, why would they do this, was answered not with words but with actions. The Americans did it because their system, however imperfect, was built on a foundation of respect for human dignity. They did it because they had been raised in a culture that, for all its flaws and contradictions, still held to the ideal that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These were not just slogans. They were not just propaganda. They were principles that, when tested in the crucible of war and its aftermath, held. They were the reason a medic would kneel beside a German child and offer water. They were the reason a surgeon would operate for 4 hours to save the leg of a woman who had been his enemy. They were the reason jeeps kept arriving, hospitals kept operating, care kept being given, day after day, without fanfare, without expectation of gratitude, without hesitation. The Americans did it because, in their imperfect, inconsistent, often stumbling way, they believed in something larger than themselves. They believed in an ideal, and they were willing to live by that ideal, even when it was costly, even when it was difficult, even when the beneficiaries were those who had tried to destroy them. The German women who experienced this care carried it forward. Not all of them. Not even most of them, perhaps. Many retreated into denial, into rationalization, into the comfortable fiction that the past was behind them and need not be examined. But some carried it forward. They raised their children differently. They taught them to question authority, to value compassion, to recognize the humanity in others. They built the Federal Republic, flawed and compromised as it was, on the principle that never again would ideology be allowed to trump human decency. They became teachers, nurses, politicians, activists. They remembered. And in remembering, they honored not just the care they had received, but the lesson it had taught. That mercy is not weakness. That compassion is not naive. That a society built on respect for human dignity, for all its inefficiencies and contradictions, is stronger and more resilient than any tyranny, no matter how brutal or efficient. April 12, 1945. A basement in Wiesbaden. A fevered child. A frightened mother. An American medic with a kit full of miracles. This scene, repeated in countless variations across Germany, was the moment when the future began. Not the future of military occupation or political reconstruction, though those would come, but the future of understanding. The future in which German women, and through them German society, would come to see that the world was larger and more complex than the propaganda had allowed. That the enemy was not always monstrous. That victory did not grant license to cruelty. That power, true power, lay not in domination but in restraint. Not in the ability to destroy, but in the choice to heal. The fog has lifted from the Rhine Valley. The rubble has been cleared, the buildings rebuilt, the tram lines restored. Wiesbaden today is a prosperous city, a monument to resilience and reconstruction. The women who huddled in basements, who clutched their children in terror, who asked in confusion why their conquerors would show them kindness, most are gone now. But their question remains. It echoes through history, a reminder of the moment when cruelty met compassion and compassion won. Not through force of arms, but through the simple, stubborn insistence on treating even the enemy as human, as worthy of care, as deserving of a second chance. This is the legacy of those American medics, those field hospitals, those countless acts of mercy. They did not just save lives. They saved the possibility of redemption. They showed that even in the aftermath of the worst war in human history, even in the ruins of a regime that had tried to extinguish the very idea of universal human dignity, it was still possible to choose compassion, to choose care, to choose, in the end, to be human. And that choice, more than any treaty or occupation policy, is what rebuilt Germany. Not the Germany of the Reich, but a new Germany. A democratic Germany. A Germany that, for all its ongoing struggles with its past, has come to embrace the values it once sought to destroy. Freedom, equality, human dignity, the stubborn, irrational, beautiful belief that every person matters. This is what the American medics brought in their kits, alongside the penicillin and bandages. This is what answered the question. This is why they did it. Because they believed. And in believing, they made it possible for others to believe as well. This is the power of compassion. The power to transform not just individuals, but nations. The power to turn enemies into allies, hatred into understanding, despair into hope. It is a quiet power. A humble power. But it is, in the end, the only power that endures. The only power that builds rather than destroys. The only power that redeems. And it began, for so many German women, in the moment when an American soldier knelt beside a fevered child and offered water. When mercy met despair and said, "You matter. Your life matters. We will help you, not because of who you are or what you have done, but because you are human, and that is enough."